I want to talk about the history of this countering the info war that we're seeing right now, because that's what it was called when it was introduced back in March. But we have a much longer history than that. Understand that when this bill got introduced back in March, it was called Countering the Information Warfare Act of 2016. Then during the summer, they changed the name. They called it Countering Foreign Propaganda and Disinformation Act of 2016. Really, this was set up to counter the info wars, okay? Because as Hillary Clinton had pointed out, it's an info war and we're losing it. Remember that quote that we played so many times here at InfoWars? They know precisely what this is. They are involved in a process of information warfare. And I want to take you back 100 years ago. 1917, the Espionage Act of 1917. So many people on the left are now seeing that they've been used as tools. We see the Democrats who've been heavily connected to the Democrat Party now seeing that they're being jettisoned in favor of the Muslims. That's what the Obama administration is doing. They're burning down a very important, what has been a very important part of their party, because they frankly don't need the Jews anymore. They've got the Muslims. Muslims have a lot of money, and the Muslims have a lot of bodies that Obama is very rapidly bringing into this country. But there's another aspect of this as well, and that's the Hollywood aspect. Think about how solid Hollywood has been behind the Democrat Party. I want to go back 100 years to a case, the United States versus motion picture film, The Spirit of 76. Doesn't that sound like a civil asset forfeiture case? United States versus a vehicle or a Learjet. That's what we see with civil asset forfeiture. This was the U.S. going against a motion picture film, and the film was about the American Revolution, singing the praises of George Washington and others. And that was something that the Woodrow Wilson administration didn't want to have, because they wanted to get us involved in World War I on the side of the British. So anything that made the British look bad was going to be hammered. And so we have this case, the espionage case of producer Robert Goldstein. And if you go back and look at this, this is one of the earliest prosecutions for the Espionage Act of 1917. And remember that it was Barack Obama who has prosecuted, I should say persecuted, but he has prosecuted and persecuted more journalists, more whistleblowers under the Espionage Act of 1917 than all the previous presidents of the last 100 years combined. Think about where this is going as we look at this move against free press. Understand, and this is the facts of the case. Let me just lay this out for you, because this is very important for you to understand where these people are. And I'm talking to you, people in Hollywood. All of you who think that the Democrats are your friend, who think that the fake news thing is something that, that is a response to this election. It has a very long history. This was a film that was created, and it premiered in Chicago in May of 1917. And when it premiered, they went in and they got the head of Chicago's police censorship board. So they started out with brute force censorship, right in your face. And they confiscated this and said, no, it portrays the British in a negative light, and we don't want that because we want to go to war. And the American people already don't want war. So we're trying to sell this war to them, so we're going to stop this information that you've got coming out here. Then they confiscated the film. The film resurfaced in L.A. with the deleted scenes that they objected to inserted back in. So then they began a criminal prosecution against a guy who, interestingly enough, was called Goldstein. Goldstein, like in 1984, remember? It was Goldstein who got his 2 minutes of hate. Now, I'm sure that that was a reference really to Trotsky, the internal fights within the Communist Party that Orwell was referring to. But I think it's kind of interesting that he used that name. Perhaps it's a coincidence, perhaps not. What they wound up doing was convicting him for aiding and abetting the German enemy because he made a movie about the American Revolution that showed the British in a negative light. He was charged in federal court with violating the Espionage Act. They said that the film was seditious on its face. This is where we're headed, folks. Understand, this has not changed. It has accelerated. As I pointed out, Barack Obama has used this same act more than all the other presidents combined in the last 100 years. So I said it was seditious on his act. They said he tried to incite riots. He was trying to cause insubordination, disloyalty, and mutiny by U.S. soldiers. He was sentenced to 10 years. He received a massive fine. He later had his prison sentence commuted to 3 years by Woodrow Wilson. They also talked about throughout the entire trial saying that he was actually a German spy, not the Russian narrative that we're hearing now, but he was a German spy. It doesn't matter. It's all the same thing. Now, why could they do this, you ask? Well, it was our beloved Supreme Court that said at the time that motion pictures did not deserve First Amendment protection. And that was not reversed until 1952. So all of you people who are saying that the Supreme Court, whatever their opinion is at the moment, is law, that's not true. And you should look at this case very carefully and understand how they can say at one point in time that you have free speech in one area, like motion pictures. Hollywood, are you listening? And then at a later date, they can say you don't have it or whatever. They can change at will because these are 9 politically appointed judges who should not be standing over our Constitution. They gave that power to themselves in a Supreme Court decision. And, of course, Thomas Jefferson opposed that as well. But then they got more subtle during World War I. Okay, we had Edward Bernays, the father of propaganda, the guy who talked about engineering consent. And they got very subtle about how they were going to do this. They made it a psychological operation. And so the very first psyops of the modern age we had as part of World War I, trying to shape public opinion to get us to support a war. And then after the war, Edward Bernays became the father of modern public relations because propaganda at that point in time had been associated with Goebbels. And many Americans think that it was Goebbels and the Nazis who created propaganda. No, they learned it from Edward Bernays. And then what did he do post-war? Well, what they talked about post-war was things like selling cigarettes to people. And, of course, this is post-World War I we're still talking about. Very powerful, the way that he sold cigarettes to people. Okay, he had publicity campaigns telling women that they need to overcome their resistance to cigarette smoking by understanding, having a demonstration of the 1929 Easter Parade. He had fashionable young women flaunt their torches of freedom. See? And we even saw that with Virginia Slims in my lifetime, telling people, oh, yeah, you've come a long way, baby. You can get cancer as quickly as the men can. Okay, he promoted Lucky Strikes by convincing women that the forest green hue of the cigarette pack was among the most fashionable of colors. I'm reading from a article here by The Conversation, taking a look at the progress of propaganda into public relations, okay? And interestingly enough, as he was selling these cigarettes, telling people that they were soothing to the throat, that they slimming to the waistline, okay, he would, at home, his wife wanted to smoke because she was watching his propaganda. And he would grab the cigarettes out of her hand and break them in half and throw them into the toilet. See, he knew that. But he would do a lot of other things, okay? He would tell people to sell Dixie cups. He would create a propaganda campaign. I'm sorry, public relations, okay, that's what he calls it. He would create a propaganda campaign to tell people, hey, regular glasses and cups in your home aren't sanitary. You need to use Dixie cups because that's disposable cups are the only things that are sanitary. So this is the way they manipulated public opinion. Now let's fast forward to the 1970s, and we found out that our government, the NSA, the CIA, were spying on Americans, just as we learned yet again with the Snowden revelations. We had the Frank Church hearings. We had the Pike hearings in the House. And they took a close look at that and said, hey, we need to make sure that isn't going to happen. And they said, oh, don't worry. We're only going to do it to foreign governments. It's going to be the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And that's going to constrain the CIA and the NSA. Yeah, right. So what did they do? They used the FISA Act to create dragnet surveillance of everyone. That's precisely what they did. They used it as a rubber stamp, the very thing that was supposed to prohibit them from dragnet surveillance of American citizens. They used to rubber stamp their search warrants for Mr. and Mrs. Verizon, as Rand Paul talks about it. You have one FISA judge, as they say, in the so-called FISA court. There's no argument back and forth. We're not allowed to know what the FISA court has decided, and yet they say that that FISA court, just like the Supreme Court, can amend our constitutional rights. They can get a search warrant against everyone. And now we're seeing this with Facebook and other issues because they passed another act, the CISA Act, that takes away the ability of citizens to sue these organizations like Facebook and Google who turn over this information to the federal government. That's what they wanted to shut down all along. And this was reported, interestingly enough, for the first time back in May 2012, that congressmen were seeking to lift a propaganda ban. After World War II, with the Cold War, they created the Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, and they said, but with the Smith-Mundt Act, we are going to make sure that they don't broadcast in America because we don't want the American government propagandizing American citizens. Well, that was being repealed in May of 2012. One of the first people to tell us about it was Michael Hastings. Remember the guy that was being pursued by the FBI? He told his friends, and the government, various intelligence agencies, and then he wound up dying in a very suspicious car explosion that I believe was an assassination. We called that from the very beginning. I still stand by that assessment. I believe he was murdered by the American government. This is a guy who told us back in 2012 an amendment that would legalize the use of propaganda on American audiences is being inserted into the latest defense authorization bill. Hey, things haven't changed very much, have they? We now see that this has happened as of this last Friday. And of course, it was at the beginning of the month, Thursday, I think it was December the 8th, that we had Hillary Clinton, interestingly, come out and say that we had reached an epidemic of fake news. And then they inserted this bill that it had bipartisan support, was put out there by Portman this summer, that was originally titled Countering the Information War. Okay. They put this into the NDAA the very next day, that Friday, passed it through Congress with heavy Republican support, I will add, because it's not just Obama that is taking away your freedom. It is also the Republicans. And we need to understand as we look at this, as this is going to play out, this has been envisioned as a partnership with the State Department, the very institute that Hillary Clinton was running. It's going to be a partnership between the State Department and the Pentagon. We're going to be talking again about this movement to censor the truth. And as we look at how this is progressing, I had a very interesting thing that I got in the mail sent today. And it was from a listener who sent a note to us along with a check and said, "Thank you so much and the entire staff for all of your hard work. I'm enclosing not only a donation, they just sent a check to us, not only a donation, but also magazines from The Nation, the Sierra Club, and the Southern Poverty Law Center." And here's the magazine that they sent here, Southern Poverty Report, and their donation card from the Southern Poverty Law Center, saying that they want you to sign a petition calling on President-elect Trump to repudiate bigotry and hate. Because that's the way. Will you repudiate the Ku Klux Klan yet again? No matter how many times he does it, and he never endorsed them, they simply try to pretend that he did. Morris Dees. And of course, interestingly enough, it was Morris Dees who defended the Klan. That was his only involvement in the civil rights movement, was to defend the Ku Klux Klan. And then he dropped out and got back in when it was all finished in the late 1970s because he got a massive mailing list working as a PR guy. We were just talking about public relations. That's how he got back in and got in, switched sides then, went from the Ku Klux Klan to the Democrats and became the Southern Poverty Law Center. But I think it's interesting, and the reason I mentioned this was because we're having an effect. Here's someone who was on the far left, listening to this false narrative that the Southern Poverty Law Center puts out there about racism, and listening to the Sierra Club, to The Nation, and saying, I can't even read these places anymore now that you've woken me up. And so we really appreciate that. And the person who sent that's for you. I'm not going to say who it was, but we appreciate that support. Now, in the short period of time that we got left in this break, and we're going to talk about this more in the next segment with Owen and Ashley, but let's not forget that it was 5-6 years ago that everybody was talking about Cass Sunstein. And remember what we were saying about Cass Sunstein? This was the regulation czar in the Obama administration. And he was pushing this idea of nudging. He wrote a book called Nudge, Why We Nudge, saying, hey, we can manipulate people's opinions and do it in a way that is good for them and good for society. That is precisely now what we see at Facebook. It is Cass Sunstein's page, Why We Nudge, our nudge in chief. There you go, right there. New York Times and these others. Why We Nudge. And remember that he also wrote another book called Conspiracy Theories and Other Dangerous Ideas. They say that Cass Sunstein, and this is going back to 2014, he said, this is The Atlantic, saying that he had collected 11 of his most controversial articles on subjects as diverse as conspiracy theories, climate change, same-sex marriage, animal rights, new progressivism, and one volume, Conspiracy Theories and Other Dangerous Ideas. They're continually telling us that we can become safer if we give up our freedom. And that is never going to happen. As I've said many times, to the extent that you give up your freedom, you become a slave to that degree. Slaves are never safe. Slaves are never secure. What they're doing is they're creating a prison around us bit by bit. And today I want to focus a little bit on this move against freedom of speech. And this is something that is being portrayed as a reaction to the election of Donald Trump. And I just talked to you about how This goes back to the early summer, goes back to March. It was a move to counter the information war, they said. Then they changed it to counter foreign influence, and they did that in the summer. And all of this was before all the stuff started about Russia. All of that phoniness. You know, when we talk about hacks, understand that we got a couple of different definitions of hacks. They're talking about it as a verb, as in breaking into a computer. Remember the older version of hack, the noun, that was a writer or a journalist that was producing dull, unoriginal work, like, you know, Hillary Clinton writing your news articles, that type of hack. Well, you know what? What it exposed was that Hillary Clinton and the people who headed the DNC, the people at the New York Times, the people at the Washington Post, they were the hacks. The truth about the election that was exposed, whoever released that information, the truth was that she lost that election because of hacks, because they were hacks, not because necessarily of an action of somebody to break in. But joining me now is Owen and Ashley. And, you know, when we look at this, this is something that people need to understand how long this has been unfolding. As I pointed out, this goes back 100 years. There was some right-in-your-face censorship to try to get people involved in the First World War. That was Woodrow Wilson, the original globalist, okay? And that didn't work as well as the psychological operations that were put in by Edward Bernays, who became a master of propaganda in the advertising business. He was the inspiration for the German Nazis and their propaganda campaigns. And then as we look closer, 5 or 6 years ago, we see Cass Sunstein talking about how they needed to nudge people, how instead of doing outright bans, they were going to do it as a very subtle psychological operation. And that's what we now see in this organization that they're creating that's going to be run by the State Department that is going to push back. It's going to determine what is harmful for us and what isn't. They were talking 5 or 6 years ago how it'd be great for the government to tell us in lunchroom circumstances. This is before Michelle had her lunchroom program. They said, hey, we need to have the government put out the proper choices for people. But when they saw how that worked out. So this is something that is not new. Your comments on how this is shaping up.
Well, it's funny you talk about hacks. It was hacks that lost Hillary the election. Hacks like Barack and Michelle Obama. Hacks like Bill Clinton, John Podesta, Nancy Pelosi. But as far as them putting us into this prison planet is what we always like to talk about. You know, back with Edward Bernays, what they realized is that psychological operations can be much more effective than actual physical operations because you can get away with these things kind of in the shadows or underground. And a lot of these movements to centralize power or to globalize, you know, the entire planet kind of go unnoticed and untalked about. And that's because of the psychological warfare that we see. So now we're seeing that with InfoWars and other independent media outlets, people are picking up on this. They can't just get away with these psychological operations without being called out on it. So the question now is, will the American public fully embrace the fact that they are under psychological warfare 24/7? And every time we see things like this, pushing for more safety or protection in the wake of giving away our rights, you know, that's, like you're saying, that's heading towards slavery. But the people in America are starting to buck that. And I think it's happening worldwide, too. And so what are we seeing now? They want to censor any independent news. They want to get rid of any voice out there that's calling this to the attention so that way the state is in control of the narrative.
Yeah, it's very interesting when we go back and look at this. And, of course, this is the book from Cass Sunstein. He talked about conspiracy theories, and yet what we have here is a clear stated conspiracy from Cass Sunstein. And, of course, he was involved with the Chicago Brain Trust, if you want to call it that, the propaganda organization that Obama came out of. He was given vast control over regulations. That's where he wanted to sit. He set it an organization that was created by the Reagan administration and say, hey, we're going to take a look at the regulations that come out of the EPA and other organizations to make sure that we keep them under control. Now, I think the proper way to do that is to make sure that we don't allow the Congress to abdicate its authority to pass laws to these bureaucracies who are self-aggrandizing, who create their own little empires. But nevertheless, that's where he sat. And if we go back and we look at this book now, 6 years later, Why Nudge? The Politics of Libertarian Paternalism. Think about that oxymoron, libertarian paternalism. Those are mutually exclusive concepts. You either make the choices about your own life or you have somebody else say that for your own benefit, I'm going to make this choice for you and I'm going to nudge you. And he says, we're going to use techniques that we've borrowed from the world of psychology, again, Edward Bernays, to help us choose better how to act. And we're going to nudge people in very subtle ways. That's precisely what they're proposing to do with Facebook and Google. Pushing information to us, withholding other information from us, doing it behind the scenes, doing it very subtly, that they can only do with computer type information like that.
Yeah, you're exactly right, David. Just to piggyback off what you and Owen are saying, basically, you're exactly right. This is an oxymoron. This, what are you calling it? Libertarian paternalism?
That's what Cass Sunstein called it. Yeah, that's his term that he came up with. Yeah.
How about ass?
Well,
Sunstein?
basically, it's a cognitive dissonance term. You know, it's basically taking two completely, crazy different concepts and trying to smash them into one. And like you said, they're basically going at a snail's pace with this, trying to incrementally get you used to this. First it's, one moral thing you're giving up in your values, then it's another thing, and it just keeps building and building and building upon each other. And I think it's kind of like when they use that analogy of a frog, being boiled. It's kind of a slow process, but eventually you realize, hey, this is what's going on. And I think that's kind of what people are realizing right now. They're like, hey, I can't take this anymore. This, political correctness, that's why Trump, I believe, got in, is because people are tired of being nitpicked. They're tired of going on this slow, incremental, descent into basically tyranny. And it starts with the language and what you are, allowed to say and what, you're allowed to comment on and, what's
we look at the language, the fact that they would create some oxymoron like libertarian paternalism.
Right.
That's what the left has always done. They took over the term liberal. Liberal used to mean somebody that believed in liberty, okay, in all aspects of your life. And then they took that over. So then we had to come up with a new term, libertarianism. Okay, now that's being co-opted not only by Cass Sunstein, but by people within the Libertarian Party itself coming out with paternalistic policies. I mean, we've actually seen them abandon their principles in the Libertarian Party. But when we look at this, we have to understand that this is not a conspiracy theory. It is a scientific conspiracy. They talk about engineering. This is Sunstein's approach. This is what he said. He's going to engineer a quote-unquote choice architecture of government-designed environment to frame our decisions. Okay, this is what we've seen from Zbigniew Brzezinski, talking about a technocracy that is going to control us. This is a very scientific, very deliberate, conspiratorial engineering, and we can see that this is rolling out gradually in slow motion. It's amazing to see this thing just gathering speed like a juggernaut and putting out this narrative that this is in response to Trump's election. This is something that's been planned for a very long time. It is engineered choice architecture.
Well, and let's be perfectly clear here. This isn't just something that's been planned for a long time. This has been going on for a long time. This is going on with the EPA. This is going on with the Federal Reserve. This is going on, and we're going to cover this big time tonight on the Nightly News. I can't believe I read this entire thing just about the National Defense Authorization Act this morning for the fiscal year 2017. That's what this is. And what we're seeing is they're taking their mask off. We've been talking about this for a long time. They're finally taking their mask off. They're normalizing the globalization. They're normalizing the federal control or the centralized control. And then what's even stranger is that they're using doublethink or INCSOC to bring it across, whether it's there's no rigged elections, the Russians rigged our elections. When they go low, we go high, yet they cry and whine and bitch and moan and burn buildings down. So it's like this crazy doublethink. And then you talk about with the Cass Sunstein, the libertarian paternalism. It's this weird attack of doublethink, totally confuse the public so that they have no idea what's going on. And then in the midst of all this confusion, all this distraction, bring in the actual arms of the technocracy to do exactly what Cass Sunstein is talking about, except it's not nudging us. They've already nudged us. Now they're putting the nails in the coffin, David.
Yeah, the nudge is simply to say you're not going to see it coming. Okay, it's
right.
Like somebody, coming up behind you and hitting you so hard in the back it knocks you to the ground. Okay, that's their kind of nudge. You just don't see it coming. Okay, it isn't going to be in your face like it was with the motion picture director that they did 100 years ago. And that's why the people on the left need to understand this. I look at what's happened in the past, what is going to happen in the future. The people who should be working the hardest to preserve freedom of speech are the people in the motion picture industry, the people in journalism. And yet they, because they're part of the establishment, they think they're going to be okay with this. They are the ones who are working to forward this scientific technocracy that is going to engineer our decisions.
Exactly, David. That's what I find actually most disturbing, is because the press is supposed to be the bastion of liberty. It's supposed to be able to help people, make decisions on their lives. And they're basically lying. We just popped up a Financial Times article, and they said some loss of liberty is a small price. So there you go. He's saying, Cass Sunstein is saying, go ahead and trade your liberty for some fake security in the New World Order, in the global government, global religion. Everything they've said that they're going to do, they've been doing, and they've been building on it and building on it and building on it. And now, like they said, they've taken off the mask. It's really, really, really getting to a point where people have to stand up and say, you know what, we're not going to take this anymore. Yeah, they have to do this in the background. And this is one of the things when Michael Hastings talked about this. He said, I had some people draw this to my attention back in 2012. This is the first time they started flirting with putting this stuff into the NDAA. And he said, this is a very important thing. And the public needs to be aware of this. We need to have a conversation about, do we really want to do this? Do we really want to throw away our liberty in the vain hope that we're going to become secure, that we're going to be safer? And that is what they're trying to do now, is to put this narrative out there to say that, hey, we just had the Russians just hacked our election, and so this is a response to that. And that's what, if you fall for that phony narrative, you need to go back and look at how long they've been going down this path and all the different steps that have brought us to here to know that that itself is a lie. That is what they're trying to bring us in. Now, here's the thing that really concerns me, and that is the bipartisan support that this has. It isn't something that's going to go away with Barack Obama. This is something that was passed by an overwhelming majority of Republicans. It was sponsored by a Republican congressman. And so this is not a left-right issue. This is not a Democrat-Republican issue. This is a freedom versus slavery issue, and we need to come together on this, and we need to understand how they're trying to steal this from us. I look at the appointments that Donald Trump has made. He's appointed Scott Pruitt as he'd been the Oklahoma Attorney General. He had been fighting the EPA on their abusive regulations, so he brought him in as head of the EPA to fight that kind of abuse. He also brought in Rick Perry, who said he wanted to eliminate the Department of Energy because they were doing a lot of things that were totally unnecessary and counterproductive. And so we see this type of opposition. Same thing with Tom Price to oppose Obamacare. What I'm concerned about, and I don't know, and I hope somebody asks in the confirmation hearings, what's the position of Secretary of State proposed Tillerman to this type of propaganda organization that's going to be run out of the State Department? They are funding it to the tune of $80 million a year. What is his position on that? What is the Secretary of Defense, Mattis? They're supposed to work together. Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State are supposed to work together to propagandize Americans. Do you support that? That should be asked by somebody who is a libertarian. If there are any libertarians left in Congress, they ought to ask them that question, because I'm very concerned about that. I don't know if this is on Donald Trump's radar right now or not. I think he is open to these ideas. I think he listens. He doesn't just take whatever the Washington establishment gives him. He's going to consider what the CIA is telling him, plus what he sees with his own ears. He needs to be very aware of how they are taking this thing to do an in-run on the First Amendment, and also to shut down any opposition, including him. So he needs to understand the threat that this poses to a Trump administration, as well as a threat that it poses to the American people. And I hope that Donald Trump hears this discussion. I hope this is something that doesn't just pass quietly in the night.
Well, this was something that also, you talk about bipartisan, I believe it also passed with a 92-7 vote
overwhelming
in favor.
Overwhelming.
And you've also got the aspect that this is something that Obama signed on Christmas Eve.
Right.
Christmas Eve? I mean, come on, folks. Let's wake up. Why is he signing a bill on Christmas Eve, if not to do it under the cover of night? But I digress. This brings us to an interesting juxtaposition now, David, because with this bill, it even admits, and we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of this, we're going to get into the who's who tonight on the nightly news, but with this bill, it actually requires the president's, he has to cooperate with this. He's one of the major power brokers with this new bill. So my question is Obama going to try to use this bill to power broker in his last month? Is Donald Trump going to be the president when the nuts and bolts are started to screw in to the Republic with this bill? That's the interesting juxtaposition that I'm looking at right now, and we've got a month to figure it out. And of course, there's the obvious question, do Americans even know that this bill was signed?
Right.
Well, that's what we're seeing with the NDAA. I'm sorry, let me just say, they always sneak this stuff in at Christmas time. They always fund the NDAA. That's where they put indefinite detention by the military without trial. And that's where they put all of these other goodies that they pack in there at the very last minute, just like they put in the Federal Reserve 103 years ago. They pack this stuff in during the holidays so the American public is not looking at it, and then we come back afterwards and say, look at what they just did to us. And that needs to stop. They need to change the idea that they can pack all of these things that don't really have it. They try to make it look like it's a defense issue by saying we're going to guard against foreign influence in our government and our elections. And so that's why they put it in the NDA, but we know that that's not what this is about.
Exactly. That's exactly right, David. That's what I was going to say, is that this time of year is actually when the American people have to be most vigilant, because we know Obama just did $6 billion of so-called midnight regulations for the EPA. There's so many different things that he's trying to do, so many different regulations and things that he's trying to push through during the holidays. And this is what they're trying to do, to just go ahead and discredit Donald Trump. And like Owen was saying, the nuts and bolts are definitely going to fall off, once he becomes president, and then it'll be something to blame Trump, on, when it was really the Democrats, and Obama fomenting this, collapse.
And this is over $500 billion that is going to go into the new NDAA bill of unconstitutional activity. And the one thing that they like to do, this is how they get sly about it. You mentioned this earlier, David. Instead of going with the HR Bill 5181, Countering Foreign Propaganda and Disinformation Act, which they had to rename this year, they had to put the foreign propaganda in there so they could push the whole Russian phonyism. But what they did, instead of having that pass, they just went ahead and just inserted that in the NDAA. So that way people paying attention to this don't think, oh, well, it never passed, it never made it to the president. No, yeah, it did. They snuck it into the NDAA bill.
Yeah, what we really need to call that is the Countering InfoWars Act and all of the rest of the alternative media.
David.
Stay with us. When we come back, we're going to talk about this professor who wished for a white genocide. That was his Christmas wish.
InfoWars has more than 15 YouTube channels and about 3 million subscribers. Our main channel has 1.854 or 1,854,000 plus subscribers. Now, they've been gaming the system for a long time to shut down nationalistic or patriotic media, saying we're right-wingers, saying we're extremists. Well, it doesn't matter who we are. We have a right to free speech, don't we? As long as we don't violate the rules. Well, now Zuckerberg has come out and said he's going to restrict conservative news like Communist China does, calling it fake news. And Google, that owns YouTube, has announced, and they've done it now 2 weeks ago, that they're going to basically make you click the bell in your notifications. We're going to show you how to do that, or you won't get all the channels that you've subscribed to, and you won't get the videos. Now, why are they doing this? It's more than just censoring. They want you to see the videos that they feed you below and beside the videos you're looking at that are corporately sponsored so they make more money. They're taking the you out of YouTube. So we're in this information war, and it's more important than ever that you promote the videos, that you like the videos, and that you send them on to others. Because the answer to the attempt to shut us down and restrict free speech that's openly now happening is for us to redouble our efforts. We're winning the culture war as true classical liberals that made this country great. We're restoring the Renaissance. So again, if you want to get our videos, so you can make your decision whether you want to see them or not. After all, that's why you subscribed. YouTube's had this since they started 12 years ago or whatever it was. And they're fundamentally changing it so you don't get it. Ladies and gentlemen, this is promoting fake news and trash news and establishment news. It's killing real independent news. But we the people, by taking action, can break the back of this system. So please, click on the bell so you get the notifications and so you get in your feed the videos and channels you've subscribed to. I'm Alex Jones for InfoWars.com.